Hey everybody, Derek from Mac Gaming here. Today I bring a bunch of games that I just tested on the M2 MacBook Pro. First of all, here we have Hitman. This game is running at a resolution of 1920 by 1080p, as you just saw the graphics settings. And as you can see, the frame rate is locked at 60 frames per second since I have VSync activated. And when looking at system resources, well, we're seeing here that the CPU is hovering around 50%. Not bad. It's actually the performance cores which are doing most of the job. But it's the GPU we're interested in. You guys can see that it's totally maxed out, hovering around 90 to 100%. And obviously this translates into an extremely hot machine. You guys can see that the temperature is hovering anywhere between 90 and 95 degrees Celsius. And it's the active cooling in this case which is helping us to prevent thermal throttling. You guys can see that the fans are starting to rev up, 3,500, 3,600 RPMs. By the end of the test, they'll be at around 4,000, 4,100 RPMs. And that's just keeping the system cool enough to prevent thermal throttling. However, temperatures do not drop from 80 degrees. So in general, the machine is extremely warm, but the game's playable and it's working at a nice and fluid 60 frames per second. Next up, we have Borderlands 3. This game is set at a resolution of 1920 by 1080p, and as you guys can see here on screen, just as before, it's barely using any CPU power, around 20%. But once again, it's the GPU that's totally maxed out at 100%. And just as before, this translates into an extremely warm M2 chip, which right now is hovering at around 80 degrees Celsius, but the fans are revving up. You guys can see that they're spinning at 5,000, 5,100 RPMs. They're making a lot of noise, and in general, the machine is extremely warm. Regarding RAM, well, it's using 5 to 6 gigabytes, and the frame rate, well, I thought we would get a stable 60 FPS, but we don't. Especially up ahead here in the middle of a shootout, you guys can see that the frame rate drops to around 45. There are some hiccups here and there, but there is still some headspace. Like resolution could be dropped to 720p, some other graphical settings could be dropped as well, but the game's looking very nice, and it is playable. However, the system does get very warm.
Press one for you! Remember to live life lightly!
Use this help! I need you alive to save me!
Reloading!
Bot! You're gonna be my new chamber bot! I'm gonna boom in your head!
Next, we have Ark Survival Evolved. This game's resolution is set slightly lower than the previous two at 1600 by 900. Once again, the GPU is doing most of the work here. You guys can see it's hovering at around 85%. Once again, that translates into a warm machine. We're seeing 80 degrees Celsius with the fan spinning at around 4,000 RPM, so you're definitely going to hear them. Regarding RAM, well, it's using 8 gigabytes of RAM, and in general, the game looks pretty bad. You guys can see here on screen, textures are mushy, there's popping all over the place. I had to deactivate all the shades. You guys can see nothing has a shadow. But, I guess we would be able to play a little bit with the settings, maybe limit the frame rate to 30 FPS, drop the resolution to 720p, and the system would probably profit from those adjustments. But all in all, the game is running, which is surprising, and in the end we are getting anywhere between 40 to 70 frames per second. So yeah, this game is it's running, but it's not, I wouldn't consider this enjoyable. Next up, we have Counter-Strike Global Offensive. Now, I do have to point out that this game is running on OpenGL, so it's being translated through Rosetta 2, and the resolution is set at 1920 by 1080p. Graphics are around, medium settings, and just as before, the GPU is maxed out, 99, 100%, which once again translates into a warm system. We can see that the temperature is slowly rising, 76, 77, 78 degrees. The fans will rev up after that, and that's what's going to actually prevent thermal throttling, so it will be able to maintain the performance. Frame rate is anywhere between 60 to 100 frames per second, which isn't that much. But just as before, if we were to limit the frame rate so the system wouldn't have to, let's say, push the performance further to achieve higher frame rates, we would probably get a much smoother experience. So all in all, guys, this is Counter-Strike Global Offensive on the M2 MacBook Pro.
Long clear. Top shot.
Well, here we have Fortnite, the only version that's available for the Mac OS environment on the Epic Store launcher. Now, if you guys all remember, Epic and Apple are in court. They're battling for some issues over the app stores, but at least I get to test the game, at least in its one of its old versions. You guys can see here the game is set at 1920 by 1080p at medium settings. And all in all, we are getting a nice and stable 60 frames per second, which isn't that bad. And even looking at RAM, it's using around 4 gigabytes, which isn't bad either. Once again, it's the GPU doing most of the job here, but hey, in return, we're getting nice and stable, smooth 60 frames per second. Temperature-wise, well, you guys can see that despite the fact that it's at around 75 degrees, the fans are slowly going up. Right now, at this given moment, they're spinning at around 27 to 2800 RPMs, and that will eventually go higher as the system heats up. So in order to prevent thermal throttling, those fans just start making noise like crazy. So I decided to give the M2 a hard time with Minecraft. I set the game at an extremely high resolution with the chunk render distance at 32, which is max, and the rest of the graphical settings at max as well. As you guys can see here, the temperature skyrocketed so bad that the fans weren't able to keep up with the heat that the whole system was generating, and eventually the whole system started throttling like crazy. You guys can see right now it's starting to lag. The hiccups are getting worse by the second, and in the end Java crashed and the game was rendered playless. So I guess that the M2 just didn't make it here. Now, to be fair, I decided to drop the render distance to 15. same resolution as before, and in return, actually, the results I got were actually interesting. At this resolution, the game is very playable. We're seeing here 60 to 90 frames per second, and temperatures which previously just skyrocketed now are hovering around 80 degrees. And the fans are barely running at 1200 RPM. So this is actually very interesting because, we can easily lower resolution to 2K, still, maybe add Optifine or a few other adjustments and probably get a much better performance of the game. Now, just for fun, I decided to see what happens if I drop the render distance to 8 and the rest of the graphical settings to low. And you know what? Same resolution. I'm getting anywhere between 100 to 130 frames per second, which is still very, very impressive. No throttling at all. It seems that the M2 is handling this pretty well. The GPU is maxed out though, but we're just gonna have to wait and see how the M2 MacBook Air handles these games without thermal, without the active cooling. So guys, as usual, thank you for watching this video and stay tuned for more M2 content.